today we are so excited to have Rosayln Eves join us. Rosalyn, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I am so excited to have you here with us. So as part of this COVID outbreak, we have had a new program, Community Reads. And so we will be interviewing local authors and local celebrities to talk about some of their favorite reads, some of their books, authors' books that they've written. And so today our very first author is Rosayln Eves, and she grew up in the Rocky Mountains, dividing her time between reading books and bossing her siblings into performing her dramatic skits. As an adult, the telling and reading of stories is still one of her favorite things to do. When she's not reading or writing, she enjoys spending time with her chemistry professor husband and 3 children, watching British period pieces or hiking through the splendid landscape of southern Utah where she lives. She dislikes housework on principle, and I agree with you on that. She has a PhD in English from Penn State. Wow, that's impressive, which means she also endeavors to inspire college students with a love for the English language. Sometimes it even works. So I kind of wanted to go with that first. With this whole COVID outbreak and everybody staying at home and being quarantined, I know me as a mom, having to learn how to do homeschooling has been a challenge. And I know you told me before that you have 3 kids. And what are their ages?
They are in 8th grade, 6th grade, and 2nd grade. So 14, 11, and 7.
All right, so you've been doing homeschool yourself. So I'm just curious, as an English professor, how are you juggling homeschooling and teaching at the same time? Like, how are you doing that?
Sometimes we're not. It depends on the day. It really depends on the day. My husband's also teaching from home because he's a chemistry professor. And so we kind of take turns that, luckily the 2 older kids are pretty independent, and it's just the youngest one that needs help. So we take turns, but it's been a challenge. This week I have a lot of student conferences going on. And so yesterday, my husband got to be in charge for the whole day. So it just depends on the day, but it's been an adjustment, that's for sure.
Does it feel like it's the whole day? For me, it feels like it's the whole day. School's taking all day. And I can't imagine trying to teach a bunch of college students and kids. I mean, that's got to feel like your day, like your whole day.
Pretty much. Yeah, people who talk about taking up new hobbies, I'm like, I don't know what that would be like. We pretty much are just doing what we have to do and surviving.
Oh, I'm with you on that. Well, today we're going to be speaking about your novel, Blood Rose Rebellion. Super excited to talk to you about this novel that you wrote. Yes, you have it. I love it. I wish I had a copy, but you know what? It's not backwards on the screen. I can totally see it. So a little synopsis of the book. In an alternated Victorian England, 16-year-old Anna Arden is barred from the society she yearns for by a defect of blood. She believes herself unable to perform the most rudimentary spells. After moving to Hungary in the midst of a revolution, Anna must choose: deny her unique powers, cling to the life she has always wanted, or embrace her ability, spark a revolution, and change the face of magic itself. That sounds like a lot and super awesome. I actually have been reading the book and I have been loving this book. So what genre, Rosalyn, would you put this book in?
Well, first of all, it's young adult, so it's written primarily for young people ages 12 to 18, but I know people older and younger have read it and enjoyed it. And then specifically the genre is historical fantasy. So there are details that are historically accurate, and then there's a lot of stuff that was made up, because if you throw magic into the history of 19th century Europe, not everything is going to play out the way it did historically. So it's kind of a mix of magic and historical detail.
Mm-hmm. So when you wrote the Blood Rose Rebellion novel, were you planning on it being a standalone? I know now it's a trilogy, but when you originally wrote it, did you see it becoming a trilogy, or were you seeing it as a standalone novel?
Well, I hoped it would become a series. There were some loose ends that weren't wrapped up at the end of the first book, so I hoped I would get a chance to write more. But the conventional wisdom is they tell you when you're trying to sell a book, especially as a new author, to write just the one book, to write it as a standalone with series potential. So that's what I did.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So the first one, Blood Rose Rebellion, second, Lost Crow Conspiracy, and the third, Winter War Awakening. So I'm
Yeah,
excited to read those
that's right
other
here.
two books after this one.
Here's the other two.
Oh, awesome.
They have an
Oh, I
amazing
love that you have
cover
those books.
designer. Yeah.
They do. That was the thing when I saw it, I thought those are such beautiful books. I just love the look of them. So who designed your books? Did you have a hand in that?
No. Sometimes authors do. I don't. I basically got an email from my editor that said, "Hey, this is your cover. Don't you love it?" And it took me, I'll be honest, it took me a minute because it wasn't what I'd expected. When the cover came out, previously most YA fantasies had, I don't remember 5 years ago, but they all had like young women in these really fancy dresses, and this was nothing like I'd imagined. But I really love it now.
Oh, well, it's a beautiful book and it definitely catches your eye. So what prompted you to become a writer? Is this something that you have always wanted to do? Or is this something that you just kind of tuned into it as you grew older where you thought, oh, you know what, I think I could write a novel? Like, when did you decide to be a writer?
It was actually some of both. I know that sounds weird. When I was in elementary school, my fifth grade teacher was the first one that said, I'd written something for class, probably very bad poetry, because that's what I did when I was 11. And she said, this is really lovely. You should share it with someone you cared about. And I don't know why, but that was the first time that it occurred to me that the books that I loved reading were written by actual people. I think I thought of authors as these like sort of mythical people that didn't really exist. And so that's when I first thought, oh, I could do this. I could write. And so all during junior high and high school, I thought, this is it. I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to write books. And I wrote some very bad books. Trust me, they're pretty terrible. I unearthed one of them a couple years ago, and it was pretty terrible. And then I got to college, and I went to graduate school, and I had kids, and I didn't write for about 10 years. And it wasn't until my second child, my daughter, was little that I thought I was going to be a writer. If I'm not writing, that's never going to happen. And so I started writing again.
So was it easier or harder than you thought, writing a book?
Um, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. The first book I wrote, I was 13. I had no idea if it was supposed to be hard or not. I just did it. But coming back to it as an adult, knowing a lot more, it was, I think, harder than I expected. I picked historical fantasy because I thought this will combine things that I love. It will let me write fantasy where I can make up stuff and have magic, but I don't have to make up everything because the world already exists. And it turns out that doing that was actually harder than it would have been to just make up everything, because there are real details that you have to go and research and find answers to if you can. So I think that was hard. And I think when I started writing again as an adult, I thought, well, I've written books before and I have a PhD and this should be easy, right? And then it wasn't easy. In fact, the first book that I wrote as an adult is still sitting in a drawer somewhere. Probably nobody will ever see it, except for my critique partners who had to read it.
Well, I had one question that really came to me. I want to know, what is your writing process? Like, how do you juggle 3 kids, your husband, being an English professor, and finding time to write? Like, how do you do that? Like that, as a mom, I just barely get along. I'm like, I can't even imagine writing a novel. Like, how do you do that?
Well, my house is not very clean. Is the first thing that I will tell you. Remember that line about I don't know. There are sometimes, because I'm a professor, I tend not to have as heavy of a teaching load in the summer. And so that gives me some time to write. A lot of it is juggling, and sometimes juggling badly. Sometimes it's what fire needs to be put out most urgently. Sometimes my kids have to be the first priority. Sometimes it's teaching. When I'm coming up against a writing deadline, then it's writing. So it's kind of, I don't know, I cycle through things. Some weeks I don't write at all, and some weeks I write a lot. It just kind of depends what else is going on. And sometimes I don't do any of them very well.
So when you're writing a novel, and this always, I think it's so interesting because I've heard different authors talk about it, but where do you start? because when I watch a movie or I read a book, you know, you begin at the beginning and then you end.
Hmm.
When you write a novel, do you write with the end where you've already finished the end and then you do the beginning, middle? Like, in what process do you do when you're writing, in your writing process?
So writers talk about two sort of camps of writers. That on the one hand, you have pantsers who write by the seat of their pants. That is, they literally don't know what's going to happen next until they write what happens next. And on the other end, you have people who are write extremely detailed outlines, know everything in the story before they write it. And I fall somewhere in the middle. I usually don't start writing until I have a general idea of the plot. I usually need to know where the story is going and have a rough idea how I want it to end before I start writing. But there's also a lot of discovery that happens as I write. Like I may be halfway through the story and I have a brilliant idea for how it should end. And that changes the rest of the story. And then I have to go back and rewrite the beginning so it fits this epiphany that I had halfway through.
Mm. So in Blood Rose Rebellion, I just thought it was so clever where you have the magic, you have Victorian England, and I love that. Like, it's not steampunk, but I love that where you take a time and then you add other elements that aren't there. And I love how you have this Victorian time with the magic elements and the monsters, and you implement that. So I was just curious, where did you get the idea for this story of Blood Rose Rebellion, and how you have Anna be this character where she at the beginning seems like she doesn't have any magical abilities? Like, where did you come up with this idea?
I was really interested in, so at the time I started writing, the idea of a chosen one was kind of big in fantasy. And I was interested in that, but I was more interested in what would happen if you had sort of the reverse of that. Instead of the one person with magic who was going to save their society, what if you had one person who didn't have magic and didn't fit in? And I liked that because it felt like kind of a universal theme. I know, at least for me as a teenager, I felt that way a lot. Like I don't quite fit in. I don't know where my place is. And writing a story like that let me explore that sort of universal teen experience, even though it's 19th century Europe and there's magic, which is not very true to any teen's experience today. But I still think some of those that feeling like you don't know where you fit, and wanting to fit in and wanting to be part of something bigger than yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, and I was also curious with this book. It starts out in England and then she ends up going to Hungary with her grandmother.
Mhm.
So why Hungary? Why did you go? I was just curious what, you know, why that called to you that country.
So I served an LDS mission in Hungary. So I lived there for about a year and a half, learned the language, fell in love with the people and the culture. And so I've always loved the 19th century. My PhD dissertation looks at the 19th century American West. I studied a lot of 19th century British literature in college. I've always loved the 19th century. And so for me, it seemed like kind of a natural fit. I had this country that I really loved, and that we don't see very much of in a lot of literature. And so it seemed like a good fit to pick 19th century Hungary. But then it meant doing a lot of research because simply living in a country doesn't give you the depth of experience and knowledge about the history that you need to write a book about it.
You know, and I think that, oh, I think I could write a story and then I'll be listening or reading a story and there'll be all these details. And I'm like, I bet that took a lot of research to figure that out. And I thought that with Hungary, you don't ever really have very many stories in Hungary. So I liked that. I liked the whole feeling, the German, the Hungary, the different influences in that. That was fun to read. So one thing I was curious about, you have a lot of different monsters and magical beings in this story. And so what I was curious is, did you make up some of these, or was this more research you had to do about folklore and the different monsters that you used?
Um, I think most of the creatures in there are actual well, not actual, obviously, because they're monsters, but did come out of actual folklore. I did a lot of reading of translations of Hungarian fairy tales and folklore, and just research generally into, in addition to Hungarian folklore, also some Slavic folklore, because in the 19th century, what we think of as Hungary was actually what is now Hungary, Croatia, Romania. That was all part of 19th century Hungary, and so it wasn't just Hungarian culture that was influencing the area. Yeah, so I read a lot of folk tales, and there's not, sometimes monsters show up and they're not very described in very much detail in the folklore or in the fairy tales. So I did take some artistic liberty in fleshing out some of them, what they might have looked like. One of my favorite characters is what they call a liederts, which is, well, it depends on who you're talking to. Sometimes it looks like chicken. In some versions, it is kind of a succubus. It looks like a beautiful young woman, but she has goose feet. And that's the version that I went to because I thought that, you know, a monster that looks like a chicken is not going to be very terrifying, also kind of conspicuous. So, yeah, so sometimes I did take a little bit of liberty in terms of how I described them or ascribing personalities to them, but most of them were actual creatures that I found in folklore.
Mm. So, on your thinking about the characters in the book, which one would you say that you relate to the most?
Well, the main character is definitely, there are some things about her that I really relate to, but she is much braver than I am. Honestly, I would say I probably relate more to her cousin, Noemi, who is very
Mm-hmm.
practical and very much resisting the idea of an adventure because I like things that are safe and that are known. And so, yeah, I think I would relate more to her than I do to the other characters.
So, on with that, if you could invite one character over to your house for dinner and actually like get to talk to one of your characters, if they were there, which character would you pick?
I would pick Maciasz, who is Noemi's brother. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in
He's a fun
the first
character.
book is the first, and that's why he's one of the funniest characters, and I think he would be highly entertaining. The first book is told primarily from the point of view of Anna, but the second book is actually told from the point of view of both Anna and Maciasz, and his was hands down one of my favorite point of views that I've gotten to written, just because he doesn't take things seriously and things are funny, and yeah, I just think he would be entertaining to have as a dinner guest.
I love that when an author takes different points of views. So you can kind of see, you know, you always kind of get in that one point of view where you can see the story from that character. But I always love when you kind of split it up later. You can kind of see from the different points of view what's going on from them. It kind of just gives the story a broader look. So in writing this novel, what was your favorite moment to write and your least favorite, without giving too much of the story away, because some of the ones viewing haven't watched it, but what did you enjoy writing and what was like the harder parts to write?
When I write fantasy, so I write both historical and fantasy, and when I write fantasy, my favorite scenes to write are the really magical scenes. In that first book, there are several scenes that are set in this sort of other world that they call the Binding, and I really enjoyed writing those. There was something about trying to create a place that doesn't exist, a place where unexpected things that can happen, a place that's like both beautiful and a little bit dangerous, was a lot of fun to write. As far as the hardest scene to write, weirdly, some of the hardest scenes to write are the transition scenes. Like the big action scenes usually feel like they write themselves because you know exactly what's going to happen. It's the scenes that get you from one place to the next. There's one chapter that I rewrote so many times, and it's just a chapter. When she goes to Hungary, she spends the first part of time at this sort of dilapidated country estate, and then they have to shift to Budapest. And that chapter that was transitioning between them in the country and them in Budapest was weirdly really hard to write because it had to happen, but it had to happen in a way that engaged readers and set the scene for all these. It had to do all these different things, but there wasn't anything big, concrete that was happening.
And I get that, trying to get from point A to point B. I just get that in just everyday life, let alone writing a story. So when you were writing all three of these books for this trilogy, which one was the hardest to write? Which one took you the longest, and which one did you feel like was the hardest to come up with?
I think the second one was the hardest. So one of the things we talk about when we talk about the structure of a book is you have the beginning, the middle, and the end. And the middle is notoriously a hard section to write because things happen or don't happen. And I don't know, they call it kind of the mucky middle or the muddy middle because sometimes you struggle with not much happening. And I realized when I sat down to write the second book that it was the middle. It was the middle of a trilogy. It was basically like the middle, the hardest part to write in a book. And I was having to write a whole book that was the middle. The other thing that made it hard was when I wrote the first book, I had all the time that I wanted. I didn't have to, it was the first book it was the book that I got my agent with. It was the first time I'd sold a book. And so I had lots of time to write it. And with the second book, I wrote it under contract. So I had a year to write and draft it. And I was doing that while I was supposed to promote the first book and finishing up the first book. And there was a lot of pressure on it to get it right. And that made it hard. And just having it be the middle, I think that what finally did it for me was realizing, and I don't think this is a spoiler because a lot of trilogies work this way, was realizing that the second book in a series, you can see this if you look at the Star Wars movies too. The second book is a tragedy, that it's going to end on a low note for the series. And once I figured that out, then I was able to figure out a plot that worked. But trying to figure out a plot for a story that leads into the final book, but is still satisfying to read on its own was really hard.
You know, I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right. On a second one, that is kind of a tragedy a lot of times on these second books. And sometimes they're kind of harder to get through because I know with me when I read Lord of the Rings, not that I don't want to give this away. What's the second one in the Lord of the Rings? There's the Lord of the Fellowship, the Two Towers at the end where Frodo gets stabbed by the spider. And I thought he died. And I'm like, they killed Frodo? And I like put the book down. And I didn't know that he hadn't died till I watched the movies in the movie theater. And I was like, oh, that was pretty sad. That was so long ago that I need to go back and read that. But you're right, they are tragedies. But yeah, and then you have that third one that kind of like brings you back. So I'm really enjoying this series, Rosalyn, and I am super curious. Do you have anything in the works? Anything that you're currently writing or maybe in editing?
I do actually. I just got some edits last week from my editor. I'm working on a book about a 19th century Mormon girl who wants to be an astronomer who gets drawn into some of the events around the 1878 eclipse that came through Denver. They called it the American eclipse because it was the first time that Americans as a whole kind of got patriotic about the progress of science. And a lot of really well-known scientists and astronomers came west to be part of that eclipse. And so it seemed like a big historic moment. And I was interested in the contrast between what would it be like to grow up in a small town with certain expectations for who you were going to become and not see how you fit into those expectations, to want something bigger than the world that you'd grown up with, but not know how to do that. And so that's been fun and challenging to write. This one's a straight historical. There's not any magic in it, but I think there are still moments that have that kind of sense of wonder because of the science, because of the eclipse, which was, by all accounts, pretty monumental.
Oh yeah, well we had an eclipse not that long ago that had everybody, that full eclipse a couple of years ago, which was pretty monumental. So that would be really interesting to read that. So, and what was that timeline, did you say, that you did? Was it 18th century?
1878, so late 19th century.
Oh, awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it. So while you are in quarantine, what are you doing with you and your family, or maybe just for your own sanity at home? Do you have any ideas that you could share with us of things to do to keep yourself entertained or busy?
We have not been super creative. I know some people have. We've been playing a lot of board games, which sometimes can be challenging because we have 5 people in our family and a lot of board games are not geared towards odd numbers of people. And we have quite a big spread between my 14-year-old and my 7-year-old. But we have some board games that we've played. One thing I've seen people do that I have not done yet, but I want to, the Getty Museum was advertising a sort of recreate artistic masterpieces at home. I don't know if you've seen any of those, but there are some fantastic ones that you just find a famous masterpiece like the Mona Lisa and you try and recreate it with stuff that you have at home. And some of them are amazing and some of them hilarious. And I've been wanting to try that.
I've seen a couple of YouTubes of dances. I've heard of scavenger hunts. I know a lot of puzzle building's been going on. I know that's what we've been doing. A lot of it's puzzle building. It's, you know, what you do, what you're trying to do to try and get through all of this. So as far as books go for yourself, what are you currently reading?
I have to think for a minute. I usually have about 3 books going. I usually have like a physical book and an ebook and an audiobook. So just depending on where I am and what I can do. Right now I am listening to a book called Unmarriageable, which is one of my favorite genres of books in that it's a Jane Austen retelling. It's a retelling of Pride and Prejudice set in Pakistan. And it's been really fascinating. It's set in modern day Pakistan, but the culture is still very marriage obsessed and still very interested in the idea of, young women are raised to be a good wife and mother, and that's their main goal in life. And so it's been really interesting to see the parallels between the original Pride and Prejudice and this book. I don't know. I read all over the place. I'll read just about anything if someone tells me that it's good, except for I'm not a big horror fan, but I read a lot of fantasy. I read a lot of contemporary. I read a lot of historical. The last nonfiction book I read, which was fantastic, was Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy. It's the book they based the movie on, and that was amazing.
Oh, I've heard good things about it. I'm excited. I'm in queue for it. I haven't gotten it yet, but I am way super excited to read that. I've read a book where it was called The Sun Does Shine, where it was about a convict who'd been serving 30 years for murder he hadn't committed, and that Stevenson came in and he was his defender and anyway got him out of prison. So I'm really excited about that, Just Mercy. So we have a question from Oliver, and his question is, what motivated you to write your book?
I don't know. I think part of it is sometimes I can be a little bit competitive, which means that if I start a project, I have to finish it because then you get bragging rights. So I think initially it was just I wanted to write, both because I liked writing, but I also wanted to say that I had done it. But then once I got into the project, I really started to care about the characters, and I think that motivated me quite a bit. The other thing that was really motivating, and I'm going to give a shout out to Elaine who's watching, but my writing group, we've been meeting together for about 8 years now. We meet about every other week, sometimes not as often, but we try and meet every other week. And there's something about knowing that there are people waiting for your writing that's really motivating as far as actually writing, because if you go too many weeks without having anything to turn in, it starts to be a little embarrassing to say, I don't have anything again. And so having people to read what I write and cheer me on has been a huge motivation.
Yeah, to have your group, to have your circle of support. Yes, I get that. There's something about having good people in your life to support you and to push you and keep you, they keep you there, keep you accountable, I guess, in a way. I have another question real quick from Marlo. Do your older children read your books? And are they interested in writing? That's a good question.
My oldest, no. In fact, I have to read you the dedication to this third book because my second book is dedicated to my daughter because she said, Mom, will you dedicate one of your books to me? So I did. And then for the third one I wrote, nice. For Andrew and Oliver, who think there is too much kissing in my books, but let me write them anyway. So no, my oldest pretty much refuses to read them because he knows that there is some romance in them. My daughter read the first one and really liked it. I think she enjoyed more that she could take the second one to school and show people that a real author had dedicated a book to her, even though her peers didn't believe her until she showed them the picture in the back. And they're like, oh, that's your mom. She said, yeah. But her best friend tried to read my book. And kids are funny. I love kids. Sometimes they make the best readers. Some of the best notes I've gotten have been from younger kids who just really loved the book. But my daughter's best friend came up to me and said, I tried to read your book. I didn't like it. I didn't think it was very good.
Oh.
So thank you.
Oh, shoot.
So you get all kinds.
Oh, kids say the darndest things. I have a question from Alyssa. Do you have any tips for beefing up or filling up a sagging middle of a book?
A couple. I think one of the things you have to do is make sure that the action in the middle matters. I like to think of the middle as kind of the point of no return. And so I look for something that the character can do that makes it impossible for them to go back to the person that they were at the beginning. Like they have to make a choice that they can't undo. But to make the middle matter somehow is probably the best tip that I have. And also get lots of feedback because other readers are good at pinpointing the places that are boring.
Isn't it hard to get feedback? Do you have to kind of have a tough spine to take the feedback? Like, how do you handle feedback? Did it take a while to kind of like
Um,
not have it be a reflection of yourself? But I mean, how do you do that?
yeah, feedback is always a little bit hard to get because you invest so much of yourself in it, and it's hard to detach your ego enough. I think it helps that I'm a teacher because I've had lots of years of giving feedback to students. And I know that when I give feedback, I'm not trying to make people feel bad. I genuinely want them to write a better paper and I'm trying to help them. And so I think reading feedback that way makes it a lot easier to take. But you know what? But it is hard. I will say that getting edit letters from my editor changed the way I graded student papers because it reminded me what it felt like to be on the other end of that. And I will regularly tell my students, the first time I got an edit letter from my editor, it was 7 pages long, single spaced, and only the first half a page was what she liked. Everything else was stuff she
Oh,
thought I needed to fix. So 6.5 pages of
oh,
stuff to fix. So,
I guess
and
that would put you back in
yeah,
English
and that,
class.
I think I read that and then I closed the email and I didn't read it again for about a week because I had to like take some time away to process and remind myself that she wouldn't have bought the book if she didn't love it. So I could work through the other stuff. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
feedback can be hard to take sometimes.
Yeah, something that you work. I have another question from Natalie. You said you started writing when you were young. Do you have suggestions for young writers? My daughter wrote a book, but now has a difficult time getting back into it. I want her to love writing, but not feel pushed into it. Do you have any advice for that?
Um,
Being an English teacher?
I mean, I think, you know, being encouraging, giving them the space and the time to write can be helpful. There are so many resources for young writers today that are pretty amazing. There is a writing conference that they usually hold up in Provo. They've had to go back to September this year because of the coronavirus, but it's called Teen Author Boot Camp. And that's not for super young writers, but from about 12 or 13 and up, I think they have there. And there are other teen writing conferences I've seen throughout the state that some of them are geared towards younger writers. A friend of mine, Jennifer Jenkins, who runs the Teen Author Boot Camp, actually just published a book on how to write that's geared towards young writers. And I read through it. I think she has some really great and engaging tips. But conferences, if you can get a kid to a conference, are great because they get to meet other writers and they get really excited about writing. And it's really great to see because then they come home and they're excited about writing.
Oh, that sounds awesome. What was the name of the author again that wrote that book? What's her name?
Jennifer Jenkins.
Jennifer Jenkins. Okay, I'm going to write that down for myself.
Yeah, I can add it in the chat.
Every now and then my
So.
kids have a, oh, that would be great.
And I wish I could remember the
So
title of
while
the book,
you're
but I left
typing
it in
that
my
in,
office.
Jennifer Jenkins, I'm sure, you can Google that and you could see. So one other question I have is, this is going back to the Blood Rose Rebellion. Did you have any inspiration for the main character, for Anna? Was there anything that inspired you, that brought her to life for you?
There wasn't a particular person that inspired her. I think some of it was aspirational, like looking at what I was like at 16 and what I wanted to be like at 16 and kind of writing the character that looked like what I wanted to be like, somebody who was not afraid to own who she was, or who at least who becomes so over the course of the character. But there wasn't one particular person that inspired it, no.
Okay. Well, we're kind of getting close to running out of time. Rosalyn, thank you so much for coming on and interviewing with me and being our first one here on Community Reads. It has been so lovely to speak to you. And I am looking forward to the other books in the series and for more books coming out. And you know what? And good luck with all this COVID, all this staying home, being quarantined with the kids and with writing and with teaching. Good luck. I wish I could give you a high five to the screen and be like, we got this. We got this for a couple more.
I will take this. Luckily, we only have a couple weeks left of the semester, and then I can focus on helping my kids get through the semester and finishing edits and everything. But thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about writing.
Oh, well, hey, it's been my pleasure to speak to you about it. I always thought it someday I'd write a book, but I'm in that camp where it sounds fun, sounds really hard. Maybe someday. Maybe when there's like a virus and I'm stuck at home. No, not even now. I can't read myself to do it. I'd rather just read them. So thank you. Thank you for providing us with this book to be able to read, and for all your information and everything for young authors. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being here with us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So for the rest of our time here on Community Reads, we're going to be having a couple of other people on Tuesdays at 2 o'clock. We will be having some more presenters. Next Tuesday, we have Elaine Vickers, who's going to be speaking to us about her young adult fiction book, Like Magic. We're going to have SUU Professor Todd Peterson. He will be speaking about his novel, It Needs to Look Like We Tried. We're also going to have Iron County Superintendent Shannon Delaney will also be joining us too. So from all of us here at SUU, at our community and academic enrichment and community reads, thank you for joining us today. Be wise and keep reading. Thank you.